What happened next at that family dinner changed everything. The silence that followed my mother-in-law's discovery was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But let me take you back to where this all began, because the truth about my husband David was something I never saw coming, and neither did she. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was 34 years old when my grandmother passed away, leaving me an inheritance that would become the center of a family war I never asked for. I lived in Maple Ridge, a quiet suburb outside of Portland, Oregon, with my husband David, whom I'd been married to for 8 years. We had what most people would consider a comfortable life. David worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, pulling in about $75,000 a year, while I ran a small online boutique selling handmade jewelry from our converted garage. Our 2-story colonial home on Elm Street was nothing fancy, but it was ours. The white picket fence was slightly crooked, the driveway had a crack running down the middle, and our golden retriever, Murphy, had dug up most of the backyard. It was the kind of imperfect, perfect life that millions of Americans live every single day. But there was one constant storm cloud hanging over our otherwise peaceful existence: my mother-in-law, Patricia Mitchell. Patricia was 62 years old, stood exactly 5 feet 2 inches tall, and somehow managed to cast a shadow over everything in our lives. She had steel gray hair that she kept in a tight perm, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and possessed an uncanny ability to find fault in everything I did. From the moment David introduced me to her 9 years earlier, Patricia made it clear that no woman would ever be good enough for her precious son. During our engagement, she suggested David reconsider because I was too independent. At our wedding, she wore black and told anyone who would listen that marriages these days don't last anyway. When we bought our house, she criticized our choice of neighborhood. The inheritance changed everything. My grandmother, Eleanor Walsh, had been a remarkable woman who immigrated to America from Ireland in 1952 with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. She worked as a seamstress, saved every penny, invested wisely, and by the time she passed at 91, she had accumulated assets worth approximately $350,000. When the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, called to inform me about the inheritance, I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through orders for my jewelry business. The phone rang at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, and his gravelly voice delivered news that would change my life forever. After taxes and legal fees, I was looking at inheriting approximately $280,000 in total assets. This inheritance represented more than money. It was freedom. Freedom from the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck. Freedom to expand my business. Freedom to finally take that trip to Ireland that David and I had been talking about for years. When David came home that evening, I was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. His reaction surprised me. Instead of joy, David's face showed something I couldn't quite identify. Relief? Or was it calculation? He sat down heavily at our kitchen table and said, "Well, that's certainly unexpected. We'll need to think carefully about how to handle this." The way he said "we" struck me as odd. This was my inheritance, from my grandmother to me specifically. But I pushed the thought aside, assuming he was just processing the shock. What I didn't know was that David had been keeping secrets. Big secrets, the kind that can destroy a marriage and a family. But those secrets were still buried, waiting to surface at exactly the wrong moment. If you're finding this story compelling so far, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps me share more stories like this one, and I read every single comment you leave. Now, let me take you deeper into what happened when Patricia learned about the inheritance, because that's when things really started to get interesting. The news about my inheritance spread through the Mitchell family faster than wildfire in a drought. I had naively assumed that David would keep the information between us, at least until we had time to process what it meant for our future. But within 48 hours, Patricia was calling our house with congratulations that sounded more like accusations. "Sarah, dear," she said in that saccharine tone she reserved for moments when she was about to pounce. "David told me about your little windfall. How wonderful for you." The way she emphasized "you" made it clear that she didn't consider this wonderful at all. Before the inheritance, my relationship with Patricia followed a predictable pattern. She would make passive-aggressive comments about my housekeeping, my cooking, or my failure to give her grandchildren. I would bite my tongue, smile politely, and complain to David later. David would promise to talk to his mother, which he never actually did, and the cycle would repeat itself at the next family gathering. Our Sunday dinners at Patricia's house were particularly challenging. Every week she would set the table with her fine china, cook an elaborate meal, and then spend the entire evening pointing out how different things were when David was growing up. Her house on Oakwood Avenue was a shrine to David's childhood, with framed photos covering every surface. His high school football trophies were displayed in a glass case, his college diploma hung in the hallway, and his baby shoes were preserved in a shadow box. Patricia had never remarried after David's father died in a construction accident when David was 16. She had dedicated her entire life to raising her son and had never quite accepted that he was now a grown man with his own family. David wasn't just her son. He was her life's work, her greatest achievement, and her reason for existing. In those early days after learning about the inheritance, I spent hours planning what we could do with the money. I researched investment options, looked into expanding my jewelry business, and even found a travel agent who specialized in heritage tours of Ireland. I imagined David and me walking through the green hills where my grandmother was born, staying in cozy bed and breakfasts, and finally taking the honeymoon we never could afford. I also thought about the practical benefits. We could pay off the remaining balance on our mortgage, which would free up an extra $1,500 per month. David could finally get the dental work he needed, but kept postponing. We could renovate the kitchen, which still had appliances from the 1980s, and maybe add a deck to the back of the house. But what excited me most was the security the inheritance would provide. For the first time in our marriage, we wouldn't have to worry about an unexpected car repair or medical bill derailing our finances for months. We could start that emergency fund that had remained perpetually out of reach. David's reaction to my planning was lukewarm at best. When I showed him brochures for the Ireland trip, he nodded politely but didn't seem interested. When I suggested meeting with a financial advisor, he said we should wait and think more carefully. When I mentioned paying off the mortgage, he questioned whether that was the best use of the money. His lack of enthusiasm confused me. This was the answer to so many of our financial struggles, yet he seemed almost reluctant to embrace the possibilities. I attributed his hesitation to his naturally cautious personality and assumed he just needed time to adjust. 3 weeks after the inheritance news, Patricia invited us for what she called a special family dinner to celebrate my good fortune. I should have been suspicious of her sudden warmth, but I was still naive enough to believe that maybe this money would finally earn me some acceptance. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in mid-October. Patricia spent the entire day cooking, preparing what she described as David's favorite meal from childhood: roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, green bean casserole, and apple pie for dessert. She set the table with her wedding china, the delicate white plates with gold trim that she normally reserved for Christmas and Easter. When David and I arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, Patricia greeted us wearing a navy blue dress I had never seen before and a smile that seemed just a little too bright. Her house smelled like roast beef and vanilla candles. Classical music was playing softly, and she had even put out cloth napkins instead of paper ones. Come in," she said, ushering us into the living room where she had laid out cheese and crackers on her best serving tray. I thought we should properly celebrate Sarah's inheritance. After all, family should celebrate each other's good fortune, don't you think? The way she said family made something in my stomach twist uncomfortably, but I pushed the feeling aside and complimented her on how lovely everything looked. David seemed more relaxed than I had seen him in weeks, settling into his father's old recliner and accepting a glass of wine. As we ate dinner, Patricia regaled us with stories from David's childhood, many of which I had heard dozens of times before. She talked about how responsible he had been as a teenager, helping with household expenses after his father died. She mentioned how he had given up dreams of attending an expensive private college to stay close to home and help support her. She praised his work ethic, his loyalty to family, and his generous spirit. I sat listening, nodding politely, wondering when she would get to the point. Patricia never did anything without an agenda, and this evening of uncharacteristic warmth had to be building towards something. The conversation remained pleasant through the main course and well into dessert. Patricia asked about my jewelry business, complimented my apple pie eating technique, and even mentioned that she had seen one of my pieces on a neighbor. I was beginning to think that maybe I had misjudged her intentions. Then, as I was finishing my second piece of apple pie, Patricia set down her coffee cup, folded her hands in her lap, and looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, dear," she began, her voice taking on that familiar tone that always preceded trouble. "I've been thinking quite a lot about your inheritance since David told me about it. $300,000 is certainly a substantial amount of money, and I know you must be overwhelmed thinking about how best to use it." I felt David stiffen beside me, and when I glanced at him, he was staring down at his plate rather than meeting my eyes. Something cold settled in my chest as I realized that this conversation had been planned, possibly even rehearsed. "I appreciate your concern, Patricia," I said carefully, "but David and I are taking our time to make thoughtful decisions about the money." Patricia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, dear. But that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you tonight. You see, I have some experience with managing money, and I think there's something important you should consider." She paused, took a sip of her coffee, and then delivered the bombshell that would change everything. "I think the right thing to do, the family thing to do, would be for you to give me the inheritance money so that I can manage it properly for the good of the entire Mitchell family. But if you think that was shocking, you haven't heard anything yet." What Patricia revealed next about David's secret financial life would make my head spin, and what I discovered when I started digging deeper would expose lies that went back years. The family dinner was just the beginning of a deception so elaborate that it would take a private investigator to uncover the full truth. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I blinked several times, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what?" "Well, dear, you have to understand that David has been supporting me financially for years. Ever since his father died, he's been my rock, my provider. He gives me $800 every month to help with my expenses, and he's been doing that faithfully for over 15 years. That's nearly $150,000 he's contributed to keeping this family together." My mind reeled as I processed this information. David had been giving his mother $800 every month for 15 years? That was money I had never known about, money that explained why we always seemed to struggle despite his decent salary. Patricia continued, her voice gaining momentum. "And then there are all the other expenses. When David's car needed major repairs last year, where do you think that $1,800 came from? When he needed those new suits for work, who paid for them? When you two had those fertility treatments that didn't work, who helped cover the costs that insurance didn't pay for?" Each revelation hit me like a physical blow. David had told me his mother had loaned us money for the fertility treatments, but he never mentioned that the loan had never been repaid. He said the car repairs were covered by a bonus from work. The suits were supposedly on sale. "Patricia," I said, my voice shaking, "I had no idea about any of this. David never told me about the monthly payments or the other money." "Of course he didn't, dear. David is too modest to brag about how well he takes care of his family. But don't you see? Your inheritance represents an opportunity to finally pay back everything the Mitchell family has invested in your marriage. It's only fair." I turned to look at David, expecting him to defend me, to explain, to clarify these financial arrangements I had never heard about. Instead, he was still staring at his plate, his face flushed red. "David," I said quietly, "is this true? Have you been giving your mother $800 every month without telling me?" He finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Shame? Anger at being caught? "Sarah, it's complicated. My mother needed help, and I couldn't just abandon her." "But $800 a month, David? For 15 years? That's money we could have used for our mortgage, for starting our family, for building our future together." Patricia jumped back in before David could respond. "Now, Sarah, don't you think you're being a bit selfish? Family comes first, always. David understands that, even if you don't. That's what good children do for their parents." The word selfish hit me like a slap. Here I was, discovering that my husband had been keeping major financial secrets from me for our entire marriage. And his mother was calling me selfish for questioning it. "I understand helping family." "Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but this is my inheritance from my grandmother. It was left to me specifically. But you're a Mitchell now, dear. When you married David, you became part of this family, and family resources should be shared for the good of everyone. Your grandmother's money could ensure that David never has to worry about taking care of me again. Isn't that what you want for your husband? The manipulation was so smooth, so expertly delivered, that I almost found myself nodding. She was making it sound like giving her my inheritance would be a gift to David rather than what it actually was. A way for her to get her hands on money that had never belonged to her. The drive home was conducted in complete silence. David gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. I kept waiting for him to explain, to apologize, to acknowledge that what had just happened was inappropriate, but he said nothing. When we got home, I went straight to our bedroom and closed the door. I needed space to think, to process what I had learned. David's financial support of his mother wasn't necessarily wrong, but the secrecy around it was devastating. The next morning, David left for work without saying goodbye. I spent the day going through our financial records, trying to understand where our money had been going. What I found shocked me. Not only had David been giving his mother $800 every month, but there were other unexplained withdrawals and transfers. There were cash withdrawals of $200 every Friday for the past 3 years. There were several large purchases at jewelry stores that I couldn't account for, including a $1,500 purchase at Tiffany & Co. 6 months earlier. I had never received any jewelry from Tiffany. The picture that began to emerge was of a man who had been living a completely separate financial life while making me feel guilty for wanting to spend money on basic necessities. I thought about all the times I had talked myself out of buying new clothes because we needed to watch our spending, while David was apparently spending freely on things he never told me about. That evening, when David came home, I was waiting at the kitchen table with bank statements spread out in front of me. "We need to talk," I said, before he could set down his briefcase. He glanced at the papers and his face went pale. "Sarah, I can explain." "I hope so, because I've been looking at our finances all day and I have questions. Starting with where this money has been going every week for the past 3 years." I pointed to the pattern of Friday cash withdrawals. David sat down heavily and ran his hands through his hair. "That money? It's for my mother. Sometimes she needs extra help beyond the monthly amount. Groceries, medications, household repairs. David, that's over $30,000 in 3 years. On top of the monthly payments. What could your mother possibly need that costs that much?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally looked up, I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. "My mother has some debts," he said finally. "Credit cards mostly. She got in over her head and I've been helping her pay them down." "What kind of debts?" "Your mother lives in a paid-off house and gets Social Security. What could she have charged that would require $30,000? She likes to shop. You know how she is about appearances. She wants nice things." I stared at him, feeling like I was talking to a stranger. "So your mother runs up credit card debt buying things she doesn't need, and you secretly pay for it with money from our family budget. Money we could have used to pay off our own debts." "It's not that simple, Sarah. She's my mother. I can't just let her struggle." "But you can let your wife struggle? You can let us struggle?" "David, I've been buying generic groceries and shopping at thrift stores while you've been funding your mother's shopping sprees." The conversation continued for over an hour, with David offering increasingly weak explanations. By the end of it, I realized that the man I had married was not the man I thought he was. 3 weeks later, Patricia called me directly instead of going through David. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the phone rang. "Sarah, I think we need to have a conversation. Just the two of us," Patricia said without saying hello. "I've been patient, but I think you're being unreasonable about the inheritance situation." "Patricia, I've told you that I need time to make decisions about my grandmother's money, but that's exactly the problem, dear. Every day you wait is another day that money could be working for the family. I've done some research and I think I've found the perfect solution," she went on to explain that she had spoken to a financial advisor who recommended putting the entire inheritance into a family trust with her as the trustee. "Of course, as the trustee, I would make sure that you and David received appropriate distributions for your needs," she added. "But having the money under professional management would be so much better than leaving it up to someone without experience." The condescension was unmistakable. She was suggesting that I was too stupid to manage my own inheritance while positioning herself as the responsible adult who should control it. Patricia, I'm not interested in putting my inheritance into a trust managed by anyone else. This money was left to me by my grandmother. There was a long pause, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. Your family? Sarah, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you don't seem to understand what family means. David is a Mitchell, and Mitchells take care of each other. If you're not willing to do what's right for the Mitchell family, then maybe you're not really part of this family after all. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I could either give her access to my inheritance, or I could find myself on the outside looking in. It was emotional blackmail designed to make me feel like my worth as a wife was dependent on handing over money that had never belonged to any of them. That phone call was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a difficult mother-in-law who might eventually come around. I was dealing with someone who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. My feelings, my rights, my grandmother's wishes, none of that mattered to Patricia Mitchell. But Patricia had made a crucial error. She had underestimated me. She had assumed that because I had spent 8 years being polite and accommodating, I would continue to be a pushover when the stakes got higher. She had no idea that I was about to start digging into the Mitchell family's finances and personal life in ways that would expose secrets. None of them wanted revealed, and what I was about to discover would make the secret monthly payments look like pocket change. The investigation I was about to launch would reveal not just financial improprieties, but betrayals so profound that they would shake everything I thought I knew about my marriage. But that's a story that gets much worse before it gets better, and you won't believe what I found when I hired a professional to uncover the truth. My first step was to hire a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, but I had reached a point where I realized I couldn't trust anything David told me. If I was going to make informed decisions about my marriage and my inheritance, I needed objective, verifiable information. I found Margaret Chen through an online search for private investigators in Portland. When I called her office on a Monday morning, her assistant scheduled an appointment for that same afternoon. Margaret's office was in a nondescript building downtown, and she was nothing like the private investigators you see in movies. She was probably 50 years old, professionally dressed in a gray pantsuit, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "What you're describing is unfortunately very common," she said when I finished explaining my situation. Spouses hiding financial information, secret payments to family members, unexplained expenses. The question is, how far down this rabbit hole do you want to go? Sometimes the truth is more complicated than people are prepared to handle. I thought about her question for a moment. Did I really want to know what David was doing with all that money? Did I want to discover what he was spending $8,000 on at jewelry stores? Did I want to know who he was having dinner with at expensive restaurants while I was at home eating leftover pasta? I want to know everything, I said finally. Whatever it is, I'd rather know the truth than continue living a lie. Margaret quoted me a fee of $1,500 for a comprehensive investigation that would include surveillance, financial analysis, and background checks. It was a lot of money, but considering I was potentially about to make decisions involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, it seemed worthwhile. "One more thing," Margaret said as I was preparing to leave. "I always recommend that my clients take steps to protect their assets while the investigation is ongoing. You might want to consider opening your own bank account and transferring the inheritance money somewhere he can't access it." That afternoon, I drove to a different bank across town and opened a checking account in only my name. When Mr. Henderson called the next week to let me know the inheritance funds were ready to be transferred, I gave him the routing information for my new account. For the first time in 8 years, I had money that David couldn't access, control, or secretly give away. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, I maintained a facade of normalcy at home. I cooked dinner, made small talk about our days, and pretended that I wasn't counting down the hours until Margaret called with her findings. David seemed to sense that something had changed between us, but he attributed it to stress about the inheritance situation. Patricia, meanwhile, escalated her campaign to get access to my money. She called at least 3 times a week, each time with a new argument for why the inheritance should be managed by the family rather than by me alone. She sent me articles about lottery winners who had lost everything. She even enlisted David's aunt and uncle to call me with their opinions. The pressure was intense, and I could feel them wearing down my resistance through sheer persistence. If I hadn't been waiting for Margaret's investigation results, I might have given in just to make the harassment stop. Margaret called on a Friday afternoon while I was working in my jewelry studio. "I have the report completed," she said. "Can you come to my office this afternoon? I think it would be better to go through the findings in person." The tone of her voice told me that whatever she had discovered wasn't going to be pleasant. I closed my laptop, locked up my studio, and drove downtown with a knot of dread growing in my stomach. Margaret's report was 23 pages long and included photographs, credit card records, phone logs, and surveillance summaries. She handed it to me across her desk and waited while I read through the executive summary on the first page. The bullet points painted a picture that was somehow both exactly what I had expected and far worse than I could have imagined. David was having an affair with a woman named Jessica Torres, a 28-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative he had met through work. The affair had been going on for over 2 years. The expensive dinners, hotel stays, and jewelry purchases were all related to this relationship, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Jessica Torres was pregnant, 3 months pregnant, and David had been telling her that he was going to leave me and marry her as soon as he could figure out how to secure enough money to make the transition financially viable. According to phone records Margaret had obtained, David had been discussing my inheritance with Jessica within days of learning about it. He had told her that the money would solve their problems and allow them to start their life together without financial stress. He had even looked at houses they could buy together, apparently planning to use my grandmother's money to finance his new life. I sat in Margaret's office, staring at photographs of my husband kissing another woman, holding hands with another woman, shopping for baby furniture with another woman, and felt something inside me break apart and then reform into something harder and colder than I had ever been before. "There's more," Margaret said gently. "The payments to your mother-in-law weren't just about helping her with expenses. According to my investigation, Patricia has been fully aware of David's affair from the beginning. She's been actively helping him hide it from you." She handed me additional documentation showing that Patricia had been receiving mail at her address for Jessica Torres, including medical bills related to the pregnancy. Phone records showed regular calls between Patricia and Jessica, sometimes lasting for over an hour. There were even credit card records showing that Patricia had purchased baby items, apparently in preparation for her son's new family. The betrayal was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that I almost had to admire the scope of their deception. David wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to leave me and take my inheritance money to fund his new life. Patricia wasn't just trying to get her hands on my money for herself. She was helping her son steal it to support the other woman and the grandchild she apparently preferred over any children David and I might have had. I thanked Margaret for her thorough work, paid her fee, and drove home in a state of strange calm. The uncertainty that had been eating at me for weeks was gone, replaced by a crystal-clear understanding of exactly what I was dealing with. I knew who David really was. I knew who Patricia really was. And I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. The most devastating part of everything I had learned wasn't the betrayal itself, though that was certainly crushing. It was the realization of how completely I had been played. Every conversation about starting a family, every discussion about our financial struggles, every moment when David had comforted me after another failed pregnancy test, all of it had been lies. He had been planning his exit strategy for years, just waiting for the right opportunity to secure enough money to make it worth his while. And Patricia, the woman who had spent 8 years criticizing me for not giving her grandchildren, had known all along that her son was about to give her exactly what she wanted with someone else. Her campaign to get my inheritance wasn't about family loyalty or financial responsibility. It was about making sure that when David left me, he would take enough money to support the life she had helped him plan. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. Not because I was happy about what I had learned, but because I finally knew the truth. The uncertainty was over. The gaslighting had ended. The manipulation had been exposed. Now I could make informed decisions about my future based on facts rather than lies. But I wasn't going to make those decisions in haste. I was going to take my time, plan carefully, and make sure that when I acted, it would be with maximum impact. David and Patricia thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. They were about to discover that I had been learning the rules of a completely different game, one where the truth was the most powerful piece on the board. The next morning, I called Linda Rodriguez, a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving financial deception. I also began planning what I was already thinking of as the Last Supper. I was going to give David and Patricia one final opportunity to come clean and do the right thing. And when they inevitably failed to meet that low bar, I was going to serve them a meal they would never forget. But first, I had to survive the darkest period of my life when I knew the truth but hadn't yet acted on it. When I had to look my husband in the eye every day, knowing he was planning to steal my inheritance to start a family with another woman. When I had to smile and nod at his mother's manipulation, knowing she was actively helping him destroy our marriage. It was the most difficult acting job of my life, but it was also the most important one, because the element of surprise was going to be crucial to everything that came next. The week after receiving Margaret's report was the most challenging of my life. I had to wake up every morning next to a man I now knew was planning to abandon me, make him coffee, kiss him goodbye, and send him off to work where he would spend his lunch breaks calling his pregnant girlfriend to discuss their future together using my inheritance money. But something had shifted inside me. The naive woman who had trusted blindly and made excuses for inconsistencies was gone. In her place was someone harder, more analytical, more determined to uncover the full truth, regardless of how painful it might be. My first step was protecting myself legally. Linda Rodriguez's office was in a sleek downtown building, and she had the kind of reputation that made people nervous when they heard her name mentioned. After reviewing copies of Margaret's report and our financial records, she was direct about my options. "What you're describing could constitute financial fraud," Linda told me. "Your husband has been using marital assets to fund an extramarital relationship while hiding income and making unauthorized transfers to his mother. In Oregon, that's grounds not just for divorce, but for criminal charges if the amounts are large enough." She explained that David's secret payments to Patricia could be considered theft of marital property, especially since he had done it without my knowledge or consent. The money he had spent on Jessica Torres definitely qualified as dissipation of marital assets, which meant I could potentially recover those amounts in a divorce settlement. "But here's what I think you should consider," Linda continued. "Before we file anything, you might want to give them an opportunity to come clean and make things right. If your husband voluntarily agrees to return the money he's given away and provides full financial disclosure, it could save everyone a lot of time and legal fees. And if he doesn't? Then we make sure he learns that stealing from your spouse and lying about it has consequences. You could end up with significantly more than half of everything." I left Linda's office feeling more confident than I had in weeks. I had legal protection, I had evidence of wrongdoing, and I had a plan. But I also had something else. I had the perfect opportunity to give David and Patricia exactly what they deserved. The idea came to me on a Tuesday evening while I was cooking dinner and listening to David talk about his day at work. He was describing a client meeting, painting himself as the hard-working husband trying to build a better future for us. And I realized that he was so comfortable with lying that he probably didn't even think about it anymore. Deception had become his default mode of communication. That's when I decided to plan my own family dinner. I would invite David and Patricia for what I would describe as a celebration of my decision about the inheritance. I would tell them that I had decided they were right about family coming first, and that I wanted to make an announcement about how the money would be used. It would give them one final opportunity to do the right thing. If David came clean about his affair and his secret spending, if Patricia admitted her role in the deception and apologized for trying to manipulate me, then maybe we could find a way forward that didn't involve destroying everyone's life. But if they continued to lie and manipulate, if they saw my apparent capitulation as permission to escalate their scheme, then they would discover that the dinner was actually a reckoning. I called Patricia the next morning to invite her to dinner on Saturday evening. "Oh, Sarah, how wonderful," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "I'm so glad you've been thinking about our conversation. I knew you would come around once you had time to consider what's best for the family. Yes, I've been doing a lot of thinking, I said. I've made some decisions about the inheritance, and I thought it would be appropriate to share them with the family first. That's very wise, dear. Very mature. I'll bring dessert. Should I make David's favorite chocolate cake? That would be perfect, Patricia. I think this dinner is going to be exactly what everyone deserves. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen making lists of everything I needed to prepare. This wouldn't just be a dinner. It would be a performance. Every detail had to be perfect. Every revelation had to be timed for maximum impact. Every piece of evidence had to be presented in a way that left no room for denial or deflection. I spent the rest of the week preparing for what I was already thinking of as the Last Supper. I bought the ingredients for Patricia's favorite meal, the one she had served me the night she first demanded my inheritance. I arranged for Margaret to provide me with enlarged copies of the most damaging photographs from her surveillance. I prepared packets of financial records showing exactly where our money had gone over the past 8 years. On Friday evening, David came home from work with flowers, a rare gesture that might have meant something to me a month earlier. Now I recognized it as guilt or manipulation, possibly both. "These are beautiful," I said, accepting the bouquet of pink roses. "What's the occasion?" "Do I need an occasion to buy my wife flowers?" he asked, pulling me into a hug that felt like a betrayal of everything we had once meant to each other. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something," David said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking about what my mother said about the inheritance, and I think she might have a point." My heart rate increased, but I kept my expression neutral. "Oh, what do you mean?" "Well, you have to admit that you don't have much experience managing large amounts of money. And my mother has been pretty successful with her investments over the years. Maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to let her help us make decisions about how to use your grandmother's money." I stared at him, amazed by his ability to lie so smoothly. Patricia hadn't been successful with investments. She had been successful at getting David to pay her bills while she spent her Social Security money on whatever she wanted. "It's funny you should bring that up," I said carefully. "I've been thinking about it too, and I've actually come to a decision. That's why I invited your mother for dinner tomorrow night. I want to make an announcement about what I've decided to do." David's face lit up with relief and what looked like genuine happiness. "Really? Sarah, that's great. I think you're making the right choice. My mother will be so pleased." "I think she will be," I agreed. "I think she's going to get exactly what she deserves." That night, for the first time in weeks, David seemed genuinely affectionate. He held me close in bed, whispered that he loved me, and talked about the future we could build together now that we had financial security. I lay there listening to him paint pictures of a life that I now knew he had no intention of sharing with me, and I marveled at his capacity for deception. Saturday morning, I began preparing for the dinner that would change everything. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, set the table with our wedding china, and arranged the evidence packets I would be presenting in neat stacks on my desk in the home office. I called Margaret to confirm that she would be available by phone if I needed any clarification about her findings. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The roast was in the oven, the wine was breathing, and the truth was about to be served alongside dinner. Patricia arrived promptly at 6:30, carrying her famous chocolate cake and wearing the same satisfied smile she had worn the night she first demanded my inheritance. "Sarah, dear, you look lovely," she said, kissing my cheek with what felt like genuine warmth. "I'm so proud of you for making the mature decision. David is lucky to have such a sensible wife." "Thank you, Patricia. I think tonight is going to be very memorable for all of us." David emerged from the bedroom where he had been changing out of his work clothes, and the three of us sat down to what would be the most important dinner of our lives. As we ate the first course, Patricia regaled us with stories of how she planned to invest the inheritance money, the research she had done on mutual funds and treasury bonds, and the financial advisors she had already contacted. "Of course, we'll make sure that you and David have access to funds for your immediate needs," she said, cutting into her roast beef. "But the bulk of the money should be preserved for long-term growth. That's how wealthy families stay wealthy." I nodded and smiled and played the part of the grateful daughter-in-law who was finally ready to hand over control of her life to people who knew better. All the while, I was watching David's face, looking for any sign that he might have second thoughts. But David was fully committed to the plan. He talked about how relieved he was that the money would be managed professionally, how much stress it would take off both of us. He even thanked his mother for being willing to take on the responsibility. It was during dessert, as Patricia served slices of David's favorite chocolate cake, that I finally stood up and cleared my throat. "Before we finish dinner, I have something I'd like to share with both of you," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You've both been so concerned about making sure the inheritance money is handled responsibly, and I want you to know that I've taken your advice very seriously." Patricia and David both looked at me expectantly, their faces showing pleased anticipation. In fact, I've done quite a bit of research over the past few weeks to make sure I fully understand our family's financial situation before making any major decisions. I walked to my desk and picked up the first packet of documents I had prepared. "I thought you might be interested to see what I discovered." The moment of truth had arrived. After weeks of planning and preparation, I was finally ready to serve them the most important meal of their lives. What happened next would expose 8 years of lies and show them both exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who has finally learned to fight back. I placed the first packet of documents on the table between them, and I watched their faces carefully as they realized what they were looking at. Bank statements, credit card records, 8 years' worth of financial documentation that told the real story of where our money had been going. "Patricia, you mentioned that David has been so generous in supporting you over the years," I said, my voice calm and controlled. "I thought you might like to see exactly how generous he's been." I opened the packet to the summary page I had prepared, showing the total amount David had given his mother since our wedding. $213,000. That's how much of our marital income David has secretly given you over the past 8 years, Patricia. That's more than we've paid toward our mortgage. That's more than we've saved for retirement. Patricia's face went pale, and she looked at David with an expression I couldn't quite read. David's face was now as pale as his mother's, and he was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. "Sarah, where did you get these? How did I get financial records for accounts you've been hiding from me for 8 years? I interrupted. "Well, David, that's an interesting story. But before I get to that, I think your mother deserves to know the rest of what I discovered about her precious son." I walked back to my desk and retrieved the second packet, this one significantly thicker than the first. Patricia and David sat frozen at the dinner table, their dessert forgotten, as I returned with evidence that would shatter Patricia's carefully constructed image of her son forever. "You see, Patricia, when I started looking into our finances, I found some charges that didn't make sense. Expensive dinners at restaurants we've never been to, hotel stays in cities David claimed never to have visited, and jewelry purchases totaling nearly $8,000 over the past 2 years. I opened the packet to reveal printed copies of the photographs Margaret had taken during her surveillance. David with his arm around Jessica Torres at a restaurant in downtown Portland. David and Jessica checking into the Marriott Hotel. David and Jessica shopping for baby furniture. "Meet Jessica Torres," I said, placing the first photograph directly in front of Patricia. "She's 28 years old, works for a pharmaceutical company, and for the past 2 years, she's been having an affair with your son. Oh, and she's 3 months pregnant with his baby." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room. Patricia stared at the photograph, her mouth slightly open, her face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and something that looked like horror. "That's impossible," she whispered finally. "David wouldn't what, Patricia? Wouldn't cheat on his wife? Wouldn't lie about where he's spending our money? Wouldn't plan to leave me and take my inheritance to start a new life with his pregnant girlfriend?" I placed another photograph on the table, this one showing David and Jessica looking at houses with a real estate agent. This was taken 3 days after David learned about my inheritance. According to my private investigator, he's been telling Jessica that my grandmother's money would solve all their problems. David finally found his voice. "Sarah, I can explain. Can you?" I asked, turning to face him directly. Can you explain why you've been planning to steal my inheritance to buy a house for your girlfriend? Can you explain why you've been using our money to take her on romantic getaways while I've been eating generic cereal and shopping at thrift stores? I pulled out another document, this one a phone record showing call logs between David and Jessica. According to these records, you talked to her every single day, sometimes for hours. You called her from our bedroom at 11:30 at night on my birthday last month. You called her from the hospital parking lot while I was having my last fertility treatment. Each revelation hit like a physical blow, and I could see both David and Patricia struggling to process what they were hearing. But I wasn't finished. I had saved the most devastating truth for last. But here's the part that I think will interest you most, Patricia, I said, walking around the table to stand behind her chair. This affair? This pregnancy? This plan to steal my money? You've known about all of it. I placed a final set of documents on the table. These ones showing mail deliveries to Patricia's address for Jessica Torres, phone records showing regular calls between Patricia and Jessica, and credit card receipts showing Patricia purchasing baby items. You've been helping them, Patricia. You've been receiving mail for your son's pregnant mistress. You've been buying baby clothes and nursery furniture. You've been actively participating in a plan to destroy my marriage and steal my inheritance so that David can start his new family with the woman who's giving you the grandchild. You've always wanted. Patricia's face crumpled. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked like a fragile old woman rather than the manipulative force of nature she had always been. Sarah, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I said, my voice rising for the first time that evening. I understand that you've spent 8 years making me feel like I wasn't good enough for your son while knowing that he was cheating on me. I understand that you've been pressuring me to give you my inheritance so you could help fund his new life with another woman. The room fell silent again, and I could see both of them struggling to figure out how to respond to being caught so completely and thoroughly. David was staring at his hands, his face flushed with shame or anger or both. Patricia was looking back and forth between the photographs and documents as if she could somehow make them disappear. There's just one more thing, I said, walking back to my desk for the final packet of documents. Since you've both been so concerned about making sure my inheritance is handled properly, I thought you should know that I took your advice. I did get professional help managing the money. I placed a business card on the table between them. Margaret Chen, private investigator, and Linda Rodriguez, divorce attorney specializing in financial fraud. She was very interested in your case, David. Apparently, using marital assets to fund extramarital affairs is considered dissipation of marital property in Oregon. And secretly transferring large amounts of money to family members without your spouse's knowledge can be prosecuted as financial fraud. David's head snapped up, and I saw fear in his eyes for the first time that evening. The inheritance money you've been planning to steal? It's already been transferred to an account you can't access. The house you've been living in? I've consulted with my attorney about maintaining sole occupancy. The new life you've been planning with Jessica? I hope you've been saving money because you're going to need it for child support payments. I sat back down at the table and looked at both of them calmly. So here's what's going to happen. David, you're going to pack a bag and leave this house tonight. You can stay with your mother, or you can stay with Jessica, or you can find a hotel, but you're not staying here. Patricia, you're going to stop calling me, stop harassing me, and stop pretending that any of this was about family loyalty. The silence stretched on for several minutes. Patricia was crying now, quiet tears that she tried to wipe away without anyone noticing. David was staring at the photographs of himself with Jessica, as if he still couldn't believe they existed. And if either of you tries to contest the divorce, or if you make any attempt to claim any portion of my inheritance, I'll make sure every single person in this town knows exactly what kind of people you really are. Your church friends, Patricia. Your co-workers, David. Everyone will know about the affair. The pregnancy, the financial fraud, and the elaborate scheme to steal from a grieving granddaughter. I stood up and began clearing the dinner plates, stacking them neatly as if this were just another family dinner that had come to an end. The chocolate cake was delicious, Patricia. Thank you for bringing it. I think it's a fitting end to our relationship. Neither of them moved for several minutes. They sat at my dinner table, surrounded by evidence of their betrayals, looking like defendants who had just heard their sentences read in court. Finally, David pushed back from the table and stood up. "I'll pack a bag," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Good choice," I replied. "Oh, and David, the locks will be changed tomorrow, so don't bother coming back for anything else. If you need your things, you can coordinate with my attorney." As David disappeared up the stairs to pack, Patricia slowly gathered up the photographs and documents, stacking them in neat piles as if organizing them would somehow change what they revealed. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never meant for it to go this far." I just wanted David to be happy. He was happy, Patricia. He was happy lying to me, stealing from me, and planning to abandon me. The question is, why did you want him to be that kind of happy? She had no answer for that, and 20 minutes later, both she and David were gone, leaving me alone in my house with the dinner dishes and the wreckage of 8 years of marriage. But for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. The uncertainty was over. The lies were exposed. The manipulation had ended. I was finally free to build the life I deserved, funded by the money my grandmother had worked so hard to save for me. As I washed the dishes from our final family dinner, I thought about my grandmother and what she would have thought of the evening's revelations. Eleanor Walsh had been a woman who believed in hard work, honesty, and standing up for yourself when others tried to take advantage of you. I think she would have been proud of the way I had handled the situation. The inheritance she left me had become about more than money. It had become a test of character, a battle between right and wrong, a choice between being a victim and being a survivor. And I had chosen to survive. The transformation was complete. The woman who had walked into that dinner as someone willing to be manipulated and controlled had walked out as someone who would never again allow others to take advantage of her trust. The inheritance had given me the means to discover the truth, but more importantly, it had given me the courage to act on what I learned. David tried calling me 17 times that first night, but I had already arranged to change my phone number. Patricia attempted to visit twice over the next few days, but the locks had indeed been changed as promised, and I simply didn't answer the door. I had drawn clear boundaries, and for the first time in 8 years, I was going to enforce them without exception. Linda Rodriguez filed for divorce on Monday morning, citing irreconcilable differences and financial misconduct. David's attempts to contest the proceedings died quickly when Linda presented evidence of his affair and the misappropriation of marital assets. His attorney advised him to accept our settlement terms rather than risk having everything made public in a contested divorce. The settlement was more than fair to me. David received his personal belongings, his car, and half of our legitimate shared assets, which amounted to very little given how much he had secretly given to his mother and spent on his affair. I kept the house, my business, and of course my inheritance, which he had never had any legal claim to anyway. Within a month, David had moved in with Jessica Torres. According to Margaret, who I kept on retainer for a few weeks to monitor the situation, they were struggling financially. Apparently, David had told Jessica that my inheritance would fund their new life together, and she was not pleased to discover that those plans had evaporated. Patricia, meanwhile, was facing financial difficulties of her own. Without David's monthly payments, she was forced to adjust her lifestyle significantly. She put her house up for sale and moved into a smaller apartment. Her social circle, many of whom learned about the situation through church gossip, began treating her with the kind of polite distance reserved for people who had fallen from grace. But the most unexpected development was how quickly my own life began to improve once the toxic influences were removed. Without David's secret financial drain, I discovered that my jewelry business was actually quite profitable. With my inheritance as a safety net, I was able to expand my operations, hire an assistant, and begin selling my pieces in boutique stores throughout the Pacific Northwest. The house, which had always felt cramped with David's presence and the weight of our financial struggles, suddenly felt spacious and peaceful. I redecorated the bedroom, converted David's home office into a proper jewelry studio, and finally created the garden my grandmother would have loved. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I did something I had been dreaming about for years. I booked that trip to Ireland to visit the places where my grandmother had been born. I spent 2 weeks walking through green hills, staying in bed and breakfasts, and connecting with distant cousins who remembered Eleanor Walsh as a young woman full of dreams and determination. The trip was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. Standing in the cottage where my grandmother had grown up, looking out over the same landscape she had seen as a child, I felt a connection to strength and resilience that went back generations. Eleanor had left everything familiar to build a better life in America, just as I was leaving behind everything that had held me back. When I returned home, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I used a portion of my inheritance to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women who were facing financial abuse or manipulation in their marriages. I partnered with local domestic violence organizations to provide resources for women who needed help understanding their legal rights and financial options. The organization, which I named the Eleanor Walsh Foundation after my grandmother, became my passion project. We provided free consultations with attorneys and financial advisors, helped women open their own bank accounts and establish credit in their own names, and offered support groups for those who were rebuilding their lives after leaving deceptive or abusive relationships. I was amazed by how many women reached out to us with stories similar to mine. Husbands who hid major financial decisions, partners who secretly spent money on affairs or addictions, family members who pressured women to give up inheritances or settlements for the supposed good of the family. The tactics varied, but the underlying dynamic was always the same. Someone in a position of trust was exploiting that trust for financial gain. Through the Foundation's work, I met other women who had faced similar betrayals and emerged stronger on the other side. Each story reinforced my understanding that what had happened to me wasn't personal. It wasn't about my worth as a wife or a person. It was about people who were willing to exploit trust and manipulate emotions to get what they wanted. 2 years after that final family dinner, I received an unexpected phone call from David. His voice sounded different somehow. Older, maybe. More tired. "Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize. For everything." He explained that Jessica had left him 6 months earlier, taking their son with her. She said he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he had lied to her about their future. He had been in therapy, trying to understand how he had become someone capable of such elaborate deception. "I know this doesn't change anything," he said, "and I know you'll probably never forgive me. But I needed you to know that I understand now how badly I hurt you and how wrong I was about everything." After he hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. David had spent his entire adult life trying to please his mother and avoid difficult conversations, and in the process, he had destroyed his marriage, his relationship with his child, and his own integrity. But I also felt grateful. Linda Rodriguez filed for divorce on Monday morning, citing irreconcilable differences and financial misconduct. David's attempts to contest the proceedings died quickly when Linda presented evidence of his affair and the misappropriation of marital assets. His attorney advised him to accept our settlement terms rather than risk having everything made public in a contested divorce. The settlement was more than fair to me. David received his personal belongings, his car, and half of our legitimate shared assets, which amounted to very little given how much he had secretly given to his mother and spent on his affair. I kept the house, my business, and of course, my inheritance, which he had never had any legal claim to anyway. Within a month, David had moved in with Jessica Torres. According to Margaret, who I kept on retainer for a few weeks to monitor the situation, they were struggling financially. Apparently, David had told Jessica that my inheritance would fund their new life together, and she was not pleased to discover that those plans had evaporated. Patricia, meanwhile, was facing financial difficulties of her own. Without David's monthly payments, she was forced to adjust her lifestyle significantly. She put her house up for sale and moved into a smaller apartment. Her social circle, many of whom learned about the situation through church gossip, began treating her with the kind of polite distance reserved for people who had fallen from grace. But the most unexpected development was how quickly my own life began to improve once the toxic influences were removed. Without David's secret financial drain, I discovered that my jewelry business was actually quite profitable. With my inheritance as a safety net, I was able to expand my operations, hire an assistant, and begin selling my pieces in boutique stores throughout the Pacific Northwest. The house, which had always felt cramped with David's presence and the weight of our financial struggles, suddenly felt spacious and peaceful. I redecorated the bedroom, converted David's home office into a proper jewelry studio, and finally created the garden my grandmother would have loved. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I did something I had been dreaming about for years. I booked that trip to Ireland to visit the places where my grandmother had been born. I spent 2 weeks walking through green hills, staying in bed and breakfasts, and connecting with distant cousins who remembered Eleanor Walsh as a young woman full of dreams and determination. The trip was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. Standing in the cottage where my grandmother had grown up, looking out over the same landscape she had seen as a child, I felt a connection to strength and resilience that went back generations. Eleanor had left everything familiar to build a better life in America, just as I was leaving behind everything that had held me back. When I returned home, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I used a portion of my inheritance to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women who were facing financial abuse or manipulation in their marriages. I partnered with local domestic violence organizations to provide resources for women who needed help understanding their legal rights and financial options. The organization, which I named the Eleanor Walsh Foundation after my grandmother, became my passion project. We provided free consultations with attorneys and financial advisors, helped women open their own bank accounts and establish credit in their own names, and offered support groups for those who were rebuilding their lives after leaving deceptive or abusive relationships. I was amazed by how many women reached out to us with stories similar to mine. Husbands who hid major financial decisions, partners who secretly spent money on affairs or addictions, family members who pressured women to give up inheritances or settlements for the supposed good of the family. The tactics varied, but the underlying dynamic was always the same. Someone in a position of trust was exploiting that trust for financial gain. Through the foundation's work, I met other women who had faced similar betrayals and emerged stronger on the other side. Each story reinforced my understanding that what had happened to me wasn't personal. It wasn't about my worth as a wife or a person. It was about people who were willing to exploit trust and manipulate emotions to get what they wanted. 2 years after that final family dinner, I received an unexpected phone call from David. His voice sounded different somehow. Older maybe, more tired. "Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize for everything." He explained that Jessica had left him 6 months earlier, taking their son with her. She said he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he had lied to her about their future. He had been in therapy, trying to understand how he had become someone capable of such elaborate deception. "I know this doesn't change anything," he said, "and I know you'll probably never forgive me. But I needed you to know that I understand now how badly I hurt you, and how wrong I was about everything." After he hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. David had spent his entire adult life trying to please his mother and avoid difficult conversations. And in the process, he had destroyed his marriage, his relationship with his child, and his own integrity. But I also felt grateful. Grateful that I had discovered the truth when I did. Grateful that I had found the strength to fight back. Grateful that I had learned to trust myself and build a life based on honesty rather than deception. Patricia called me once, about a year after David's call. She was in the hospital, she said, facing surgery for a condition that might be serious. She wanted to apologize and make amends before it was too late. I listened to her confession, her admission that she had been wrong to encourage David's deception and try to manipulate me out of my inheritance. She said she had been desperate to keep her son close and hadn't thought about the damage she was causing to other people. "I lost him anyway," she said, her voice weak over the phone. "He barely speaks to me now. He blames me for encouraging him to make choices that cost him everything that mattered. I felt sorry for her too, but I didn't forgive her. Some betrayals are too complete, too calculated, to be forgiven just because someone is facing their mortality. I told her I hoped her surgery went well, and I meant it. But I also told her that I wouldn't be visiting, sending flowers, or pretending that her apologies changed what she had done. 3 years after the divorce, I met someone new. Michael was a widowed father of 2 who owned a small bookstore downtown. He was nothing like David, quiet where David had been flashy, honest where David had been deceptive, content with simplicity where David had always wanted more than he had. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect, rather than passion and grand gestures. He knew my story and I knew his. We both understood the value of honesty and the cost of betrayal. When he proposed 2 years later, it was with a simple question: would you like to build a life together based on truth? The answer was yes. Our wedding was small and simple, held in the garden behind my house with just our closest friends and Michael's children in attendance. I wore my grandmother's wedding dress, which I had found preserved in tissue paper in her attic. The ceremony was officiated by the pastor from Michael's church, a woman who had counseled us through our engagement and helped us build communication skills that would serve us well in marriage. As I said my vows to Michael, I thought about the journey that had brought me to that moment. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had instead become the catalyst for creating a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything I had ever imagined possible. The Eleanor Walsh Foundation had grown into a regional organization that helped hundreds of women each year. My jewelry business had expanded into a small but successful enterprise that employed 6 other women and supplied boutiques throughout the Western United States. My marriage to Michael was built on the kind of honest communication and mutual respect that I had never experienced with David. Most importantly, I had learned to trust myself. I had learned that my instincts were valuable, that my boundaries were valid, and that I deserved relationships based on honesty and respect. I had learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. And I had learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the foundation for the best thing that happens to you. Looking back now, 5 years after that final family dinner, I can see how every painful moment was necessary for my growth. The betrayal forced me to develop strength I didn't know I possessed. The deception taught me to trust my instincts. The financial manipulation showed me the importance of maintaining independence. Even the cruelty of discovering David's affair while we were struggling with infertility led me to a deeper understanding of what I truly wanted from life and relationships. The house on Elm Street is still my home, but it's been transformed completely. The rooms that once felt heavy with secrets and financial stress now buzz with creativity and purpose. My jewelry studio occupies the entire converted garage, where I design pieces that are sold in boutiques from Seattle to San Francisco. The home office where I once discovered the evidence of David's betrayals now serves as the headquarters for the Eleanor Walsh Foundation. The garden my grandmother would have loved flourishes in the backyard, tended by Michael's children, who call me their bonus mom, and by the neighborhood kids who stop by to help with the vegetables we donate to the local food bank. Every spring when the roses bloom, I think about the pink roses David brought me that last Friday night, and I'm grateful that his empty gestures led me to appreciate the real beauty that surrounds me now. The most unexpected lesson from my experience has been learning that transformation often comes through crisis. We tell ourselves stories about gradual change and steady progress, but sometimes real growth requires complete destruction of what came before. My grandmother's inheritance didn't just give me financial freedom. It created a situation that forced me to confront the lies I had been living with and make choices that changed everything. Today, when women call the foundation desperate for help with manipulative partners or family members who are pressuring them to give up financial resources, I tell them what I learned that night at my dinner table. The truth may be devastating in the moment, but it's also liberating. Once you know what you're really dealing with, you can make informed decisions about your life. The Eleanor Walsh Foundation has become my life's work, but it's also become a testament to the power of turning personal pain into purpose. Every woman we help represents a victory over the kind of manipulation and abuse that once nearly destroyed my life. Every successful divorce we facilitate, every financial independence plan we help create, every moment of clarity we provide to someone who has been living in confusion, all of it honors my grandmother's memory and validates the choice I made to fight back rather than give in. The most important lesson from my story is this: family loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own well-being or financial security. Real love doesn't demand that you give up what's rightfully yours. Healthy relationships are built on honesty, not manipulation. And sometimes the best thing you can do for your family is to refuse to enable their worst impulses. My grandmother Eleanor Walsh came to America with nothing but determination and dreams. She built a life through hard work and careful planning, and she left her inheritance to me because she believed I would honor her legacy by using it wisely. The greatest honor I could give her memory wasn't to hand the money over to people who felt entitled to it, but to use it to build something meaningful and help other women find their own strength. That final family dinner changed everything, but the transformation it began continues every day. Every boundary I maintain, every honest conversation I have, every woman I help through the foundation, every choice I make based on my own values rather than someone else's manipulation. All of it flows from the decision I made that night to serve the truth instead of continuing to swallow lies. The inheritance my grandmother left me was more than money. It was an opportunity to discover who I really was and what I was capable of becoming. The dinner where I revealed the truth about David and Patricia was more than an ending. It was a beginning, and the life I built from the ashes of that devastating night has been more rewarding than anything I could have imagined when I was living in the shadow of other people's lies. Eleanor Walsh would be proud, I think, of how her granddaughter learned to fight for herself and use her resources to help other women do the same. The inheritance she worked so hard to leave behind didn't just change my life. It became the foundation for changing hundreds of other lives as well. If you found inspiration in this story of transformation and resilience, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of courage and empowerment. Leave a comment below about your own experiences with family dynamics and financial boundaries. I read every single one and I'm always inspired by your strength and wisdom. Remember, you deserve relationships built on honesty and respect, and you have the right to protect what's rightfully yours. Until next time, stay strong and stay true to yourself.